What we need to do is add on some events. The key ones that we care about are going to be when something is dragged over. I'm going to do this in the console first of all, so we've got a visual way to see this stuff, and then we'll move it into our web template. The first thing I need to do is tell it which area we're using as our drop zone. I'm just going to declare that as a variable, and I'm going to get our div and ID of drop zone. Then I can attach some events to that. So what do we want to listen out for? The first of these events is going to be drag over, as that's very much like just placing a cursor over this area, but it's when you've got some files selected. I'm going to say for drop zone, which we've already defined as our variable, on, and then which event are we listening out for. First of all, we want drag over, and then what do we want to do? So I'm going to create a function, shift and enter for a new line because I don't want it to run right away. And what I want to do is add a class of drag over. So all I'm achieving for now is just some visual difference when files are dragged over. So I'm going to say this, meaning the element that has been dragged over. I want to add a class, something that I can select with CSS, and I'm going to call that drag over. Finally, I want to return false, so come out at that point. Don't keep listening out on that same event. And then just close my function. And there's no visible difference yet until I try and interact with that. So let's see what happens if I drag a file now. So I can see there's some visual difference when the file goes onto the area. But if I was to change my mind, pull the file out of the area, move it back to the folder or whatever, nothing happens yet. So what we need is another event, which is very similar, but this is going to be a drag leave, and rather than add a class, I'm going to remove a class. Back to the console, let's copy and amend that one. So I'm going to say on drag leave this time. Still the same class of drag over, but instead of add class, I want to remove class. When we drag over, give it the drag over class. If we drag out of that area, remove the drag over class. Now it should look more interactive than what it did before. So I try and drag a file in, drag a file out, drag a file in, drag a file out. It's not actually doing anything for us yet, but we've got some visual feedback and we can see we're detecting the right events. So the key one that we're going to care about is the drop. What do we want to happen when the files are actually placed within that? So again, we'll need a function. We're going to do this on the drop event, and we want to prevent that browser default as the first thing that we do. Like we saw before, if I just drag a file into the browser, it's just going to open it or it's going to download it. That's not what we want. My next event, start by saying it's the drop zone that we're interested in, dot on, and then which event are we listening out for. So this time, of course, it's going to be a drop. Again, we want a function. We're going to pass it the event object because we need to tell it not to do what this event would do by default. The way we do that is to say for that event object, prevent default. And then what is our actual functionality? So we're going to use the this keyword again. So this HTML element that's been dropped onto, we again want to remove that class of drag over. That's just for our visual feedback. We've got a data transfer object that gives us access to all our files, and if you're wondering where these events and all this browser information comes from. Really good place to read up on that is MDN, and if you look at the drag and drop files API, I believe it's called, you see we've got detail of here are all the events. And then a little bit further down we've got the data transfer constructor. That's what we're going to have to try and access to read these files. So I think a useful starting point will be, we'll at least list the files. We're going to say when that's dropped, let's give ourselves a way to actually read those files, to interact with them. I'm going to say E for event, I want the original event, I want the data transfer in particular, and the files that are part of that data transfer. I can't do anything with those just yet until I loop over those files. What we're going to need to do is to say for each file in that list of files, read them and do something with them. So for now I'm just going to say console.log their name. So I'm going to say jQuery for each of the files we want to do this function. Iterating over each file and what do we want to do with them. So for now let's just say, for example, we want to console.log the file.name. And if we weren't sure what that included, we could as well, before our for each, just simply say we want to console.log files, because we want to see what properties are in there. If we didn't know, for example, the file name was simply a file.name. Okay, let's give that a go. Close the function. Now what happens when I drop a file or a number of files? Look back in the console and I can see I've got the file names. Here's what the file list looked like. I've got all kinds of metadata about the files, but I don't have the files themselves. We'll see how to deal with that in just a moment. And then when we did our for loop, we specifically said get us that name property, do something with that. So for now that was just console.logging that file name. Now we get into something a little bit more complicated. What we need to tell the browser to do is to read those files. The drag and drop part is nice and easy, that's just a few basic events, but then we've got some specifics to do with files. Let's move our code over into Power Pages before we go any further. I'm going to bring in a commented version of this code. This is what I'll be sharing on the blogs for you to reuse. Okay, so we've got just a commented version of what we were doing in the console. I don't want to lose it each time the page loads, which is why I've copied it into here. And I've said that I want this to happen on document.ready. So when the page is loaded, the UI is ready for us to interact with. That's when we want to add these events.